Hello, welcome back to yet another video. I cannot believe that the weather's holding out like this to actually film these. Slightly different location today. I'm in one of the fields. You can see our sheep just down there. Rare breeds they are. Soay is what they're called. But anyway, today I'm going to do a bit of a video on how to inspect a potential used purchase. Might be useful to some of you, not useful to others. I'm going to try and focus on things that are a bit less obvious, if you know what I mean. I've watched a few of these videos where they go over them and they're just like, come on, anybody knows that. So I'm going to go a bit more in depth. I'm going to try and apply it to most quads, but each has their individual faults and foibles. You can message me on that because I know most of them, to be honest. But we'll start from the front. So obvious features I'm not going to really mention. You got to check your lights, check your brakes, etc, etc, etc. Cosmetic condition, well, you know your cosmetic condition. If it looks like crap, it looks like crap, otherwise, you know. So starting from down here in the front diff, you want to check your CV boots. These are relatively dry rotted, but I would expect that for the year. What you really want to try and avoid is ripped boots with most of the grease out of them. I'm not so worried about a ripped boot if it's ripped, but you can still see plenty of fluid within it. Just one that's been dry for a very long time, because then your axle will be buggered. Best way to check for axle wear is to get your bike on full lock, stick her in low range, and just slowly move forward. You want to listen for clicking, etc, etc. You could even push the bike to and fro, because the engine will drown out some of the noise. So just pushing it back and forwards will make sure you really do eliminate any chance of your CVs being absolutely knackered. Staying on CVs, another thing you want to do is you want to grab your shaft. Sounds a bit wrong, but you want to grab it and properly move it back and forth. You can see these have absolutely no movement in them at all. If you've got a CV shaft that's quite floppy, that indicates two things, or can indicate two things. One, well, three actually, to be fair. One is your CV shaft's knackered, but you'll be able to ascertain that by the method I just told you. Two is that the bearings inside your diff have gone. That's bad. Reasonable job to replace. I'd be wanting to negotiate some serious money off for that. Or three, the splines inside your actual diff have worn, which is actually quite common on a lot of these bikes. The seals around the CVs wear and get busted up. Grit gets in there and it just destroys the splines inside your diff and on your axle. Often you can get away with just replacing the axle and them splines inside the diff being okay to take a new axle, which we did on the diesel, if you didn't see in another video. But sometimes you can have the splines inside your diff completely knackered and then you need a new diff, which is even worse than doing bearings on it. Best way to test for that is to put some serious load on. So get out on a hill, put it in two-wheel drive first, if you've got independent rear suspension, floor it and listen for any grinding, and also see if just the single wheel is spinning. If you've only got one wheel spinning and not two, these all have locked rear differentials. So that, well, in general they do. A few of them have open rear diffs, a couple of Polaris, but they're normally locked. So if one wheel is spinning and not two, you've definitely got messed up splines. Bit more tricky to tell on the front, but the best way to do it is to put it in four and have the bike on a slope backwards, because then a lot of pressure is going to be on your front wheels to try and drive the bike back. And again, listen for any grinding or clicking, because that can be a severe issue and it is more common than you might think. So staying down on the front end, you want to check for frame rot. You might not think that's very common, but it's more common than you may imagine. Most bikes in the UK are going to look like this. Surface rust on the base, particularly when they get to this age. But what you really want to look out for is rot. Honda TRXs, bikes like that really do suffer with their frame rot. Yamahas not so much. Kawasaki's are in between. They tend to rot, but they're not too bad. Another thing you want to look out for down here is ball joints. What you really could do with is bring in one of them little trolley jacks, the 1 ton ones. They're big enough to carry around with you, but not too big that you look like an absolute muppet pulling out of the back of your truck. But if you haven't got a jack with you, what you can do is get the wheel on full lock and really shake the bike. You probably won't be able to tell very well in this one, but this one has some play in it. You can also shake the wheel. And what you want to look at is for is movement down there on the lower one, which will be very obvious, and the upper one which will be less obvious. As I say, you really need to bring your jack, but if not, you can use the shaking method. They're not very expensive to replace, but if you can't do it yourself, you're still looking at about £100 a joint. So staying down here, but moving on inside the disc, almost always, every quad I've bought really, the brakes are always shot. Not expensive to source, so you can source aftermarket cabs from China and the like very cheaply. But the discs, well, they normally see a lot of hammer. I've had multiple bikes where they've worn through the pad material, then the metal on the pad, then the piston on the caliper. So you need new calipers, and you also need new discs. So obviously you can check if the brakes are working. If they are, great, but if they're making any sort of noise, if they don't work, what you really want to do is get your finger in here and just check for any wear on the back of the disc. If you put your finger right up to the edge of the disc and pull back, you shouldn't be able to feel much of a groove. A bit of scoring's okay. This one has a little bit of scoring, but you really don't want to feel a big bump down from the unworn edge of the disc to the bit that's been wearing. That might indicate that your pads are gone and they're using the caliper as the pad. So moving on to the top of the bike, you want to check the racks. Severe surface corrosion isn't a problem, but these are an absolute nightmare to do yourself. They take hours and hours and hours of sanding, or you've got to pay a fair bit for somebody to powder coat them. So just a brief consideration. Most of these bikes, the radiator cap is under these covers at the front, so you can't always get to them very easily. So to check your water, you want to find the expansion tank. Most of the bikes, it's under the side panel. Polaris, Yamaha, Kawasaki, I believe they're all under the side panel. So there's the expansion bottle on this bike. You want to make a note of the empty and full level. You see this one's got plenty of fluid in it. You want to check the colour as well. Brown isn't good, but really you want to be avoiding milky colouredness. Milky coloured indicates the head gasket is gone. Not very common on petrol bikes, but I've had a lot of diesel bikes with their head gaskets gone. Again, we've done a Polaris diesel recently with their head gasket gone, which hasn't gone very well, which you'll see in another video. You also want to check for oil contamination in there, which could also indicate head gasket failure. If it's low, obviously you could be having overheating troubles. I'll just stick this panel back on and I'll be back. Okay, so all them panels are put back together. Now a couple of more things to mention on the front suspension that often go is wheel bearings, but they're obvious. Again, you can shake them, or ideally you bring a jack. A good indication as to whether people have been messing around with the wheel bearings is if these hubcaps are missing. You can, because a lot of these don't use modern wheel bearings, they use old-fashioned tapered wheel bearings. So one way to make the wheel bearing tighter is to just absolutely hammer down these nuts. You can see somebody's done it with this one. Which is only a temporary fix, a couple of 100 miles, it'll be back as bad as it was, so that's something to look out for. Again, another common fault, these shock bushes tend to go. They're easy to do on Polarises and Arctic Cats, but harder on Yamahas because these are more automotive style bushings with a steel ring and rubber inside them rather than just two pieces of rubber slotted over a dowel, which is they use on the Polarises and Arctic Cats. So moving on to the rear suspension, while we're on suspension, obviously if you've got an independent suspension bike, this will be the same as the front, but if you've got a solid axle bike like this particular one, you really want to check these bushings back here. You can do that by, again, really shifting on your rack or lifting it up and moving this whole axle back and forth. They are an absolute pain to change. It's a reasonable job because they've got a lot of preload on them, so you want to make sure they're not gone. Again, rear shock bushings, not too much of a big deal. Discs on the back, much easier to check. See, this one has no wear at all on it. There's no groove in that. And you can see the pads very easily back here as well. Rear axles, depending on which quads they are, these lose oil very easily. Partly because I think I explained in the introduction video in this, these boots tend to rip because they get attacked by a brash, which leaves the rear main seals to go. That drains a lot of oil out the axle and the engine. This is actually oil bathed, this shaft in here, but also because on a lot of these bikes, obviously you've got the rubber seals on either side of the axle. and a rubber seal for the UJ if they've got independent rear suspension. These are obviously exposed to a lot of dirt and a lot of grit and a lot of wear. So these do get a fair bit of hammer and they start leaking. Also, another quick common note on these, depending on how far you want to go, you could actually crawl under the bike. A lot of these use Torx heads to drain the fluid out, and they never ever get changed. So when somebody does come to change them, their Torx head gets stripped, which is a right nuisance because you can't drain the fluid unless you take the axle, or unless you drill it out, unless you take the diff out and turn it upside down, obviously. So you can check that. I don't think we'll be able to see on this particular bike because the guard, but I think these use a bolt anyway on the Yamaha, so they're not so bad. CDIs and electronics, obviously if it runs, no major issues, but you want to do check for insulation tape like this. If people have been messing around with it and they tape things back up, you know if it's had a problem in the past, which could lead to more potential issues. These electrics are actually incredibly easy to sort out, but if you've got no experience, they can be incredibly hard. A lot harder than bushes and things like that. They're a very simple system, but as I say, if you've got no knowledge, then it's one of them. Exhausts, another common area to rot away. That's pretty obvious. I'm not going to spend much time dwelling on that. They're easy to weld up if you've got any experience with a MIG welder. This one's been welded on this side, as you can see. Been done reasonably well. That's not actually a hole, believe it or not. It's just a bit of a shallow area of slag. So CVTs, almost every bike other than the Hondas uses CVTs. On the Hondas, you really want to be careful with the electric shift. They go a lot. I've very, very rarely come across a Honda that hasn't had something done with the electric shift if they're over about 5 or 6 years old. See, in terms of CVTs, I mentioned in the previous video, you have a primary clutch here, secondary clutch there. What happens is your belt expands backwards from this primary clutch, which creates a tighter drive ratio, so you go quicker and quicker the further the belt goes back. To drive that primary clutch, there's a wet clutch inside the actual engine block itself. They work on centrifugal force, so as you rev higher, the clutch plates pop out and contact a drum, which drives this primary clutch. The friction plates on there are designed to use with oil with friction modifiers in them, so that they can still grip in the drum, because it's actually an oil-bathed clutch. People often use incorrect automotive oil in these, which causes end clutches to slip and burn up. Best way to check for that is to have the bike running in 4-wheel drive, hold both your brakes in low range, give it a good blip of a throttle like that. You really want to feel the bike trying to lurch forward, little launch forward. If it doesn't and your bike just revs up, your wet clutch is on the way out, which isn't good at all. Switchable to in 4-wheel drive. On the Yamahas and a lot of other bikes, this is very easy to check. Literally all you do, switch her on, push the button and listen. Obviously you can hear the motor run, which is down on the diff. Indicator lights, I wouldn't worry about them if they don't come on. They work on a little push button switch inside the diff, which always breaks on most bikes, not just the Yamahas. Polaris are much harder to check because they work on like an all-wheel drive type system. You click the button and you don't hear any motor at all. All it does is an electrical current down to the hubs, which are electromagnetically controlled. And what that does is enable the wheels to start spinning when you have a slip-in situation. So the only real way to check that is to get it on very muddy or soft ground and physically see the wheels spinning or jack it up. There's no other way, unfortunately, so they are quite hard to determine that they're working. But luckily, although they're a fairly complex system, they don't tend to break. So another little comment I would make, and this is an obvious feature, but if your seat has been recovered like this, the bike has probably led a hardish life in the past. Now, I'm not too worried about it being recovered, but under the seat, you can see with this one, the foam is worn away. So that's a decent indication that this at one point was a farm bike. The seat got ripped, then they sat on the seat while it was carried on, you know, it'd been in the condition it was, which has worn it away. If it's like that, it's unlikely to have been owned by somebody who's just using it for pleasure purposes. It's probably been a work bike. Another dead giveaway, even if your seat looks good, is these type of homemade or home installed staples underneath. So I wouldn't be too worried about that, but it's just a bit of an indication of what sort of life it's probably led. So again, going under the seat now. Sorry, I just got briefly interrupted there. Going on the seats, your airbox is going to be under the seat on almost every bike. On the diesel, a couple of the diesels, it's under the fuel tank lid, but you know, that's easy enough to find. So you do want to check the condition of these. This one's all right. Could do with a quick wash. So a few tractors going up and down today. But you don't want to see these absolutely caked in fuel and oil. That could lead to carburetor problems or indicate a carburetor problem. People say, oh, you know, if the filter's dirty, don't buy it, blah, blah, blah. I'm not too worried about maintenance, as long as it physically runs okay. And even if it doesn't run okay, as long as it doesn't smoke, which I'll get onto next, it's really not an issue. You can soon sort that out. Right, so we can get this clip back on without pausing the video. I'm not certain this will start up okay, because I am waiting on a couple of carb bits for it. If you've seen my carburetor video, which I might not have uploaded by the time I put this on, I used Chinese parts off a second-hand carb I bought, which aren't the best, but let's see. Okay, so she's started all right. Oh, need to give it a bit of throttle by the looks of it. Oh, come on. Okay, so she's running now. So when it's running, what you can do, sorry, I'm just going to keep my hand on the throttle just in case, as I say, I'm waiting on some new parts. You can remove the emissions hose on there. And what you want to do, that emissions hose comes up from the actual engine itself. And you want to look for any smoke coming out of that emissions hose. If I rev it now, you can't see any smoke out of the emissions hose. That means the engine has got very low blow-by. So what that means is that the pistons are in good condition. They're not allowing any compression gases to escape into the actual chamber of the engine, which will be coming out of this hose. It's fine to feel gas coming out, that's completely normal, but it doesn't want to look smoky, like combustion gases have gotten into the chamber. So that's engine check number one, that's pretty important. Obviously the second check is just a visual smoke check. This one's absolutely fine. A little bit of smoke on an older Honda I wouldn't be worried about, because they are notorious for the valve seals going, which is a decent issue to solve, but it's not a terminal issue if you're not too worried about having a bit of smoke. You want to be listening to tapping at the top of the engine. Obviously this one, revving her up is very smooth and linear. A lot of the Polaris bikes do tap a little bit from the factory, so I wouldn't be too worried about that. But you don't want to have a Yamaha or a Kawasaki or anything like the older bikes tapping from the top end. I mean, that could just be loose tappets, which isn't too much of an issue, but it could also be a very worn down cam, which is a lot more of an issue, or a loose timing chain. That'll be more, if it's a timing chain, you'll probably hear it more when you rev the bike up. On idle, it probably won't sound too bad. Time chains can be done fairly easily, but they are quite expensive to have people have and do them for you. So the next engine check, after you've ascertained the engine is half decent, is to remove the side covers on both sides. I'm not going to bother removing the other one just for the purposes of this video. And really have a good look at the block and the cylinder head. Oil isn't a major issue, or it's not oil, sorry, mud isn't a major issue. I would be reasonably expectant to see some levels of mud like that on a used bike. But I really don't want to see is moisture coming from between the cylinder head and the trying to think of the piston barrel, which could indicate a failed head gasket or a beginning to fail head gasket. I don't want to see any oil leaking from the actual barrel, as I say, because then gaskets are a pain to change, because you've got to strip basically the entire engine to get to them. Apologies, the filming isn't the greatest. So yeah, CVT covers, you want to check the seal while you've got the cover off. If the seal is badly worn, you could have moisture or mud in your CVT clutches, which could indicate further wear. Also, while it's off here, I did explain in the video I did on this yesterday, a bit of an introductory video, if I can get in there. These mechanisms for the rear brake fail very, very easily. They build up with crud, so they're quite a complex system. A cable operates a secondary hydraulic cylinder for the rear caliper, and yeah, they just get filled with mud and rust away. So you want to check your foot brake. You might want to make sure it returns, so your spring's in good condition and it's got some kind of feel to it, which this one has. And again, your cable operated handbrake should return and have some feel to it. So yeah, let's pause this again, or I'll stick the cover back. So the last thing I want to note on the engine is if when you start it up, you've gone through the checks that I just mentioned, so you've got no blow-by, you've got no smoke, you've got no rattling, the last thing you want to ascertain is that it actually runs smoothly. So acceptable is a bit of choke, obviously, but you want to make sure it doesn't die down or bog right through the rev range. You want to take it on a good run right through the throttle. If it does bog down, it's not an issue. Second-hand carburetors or aftermarket carburetors for these, any quad basically, are very, very cheap. I wouldn't be at all concerned if the engine is poor running. If it's a fuel-injected engine, like some of the more modern ones, then yes, it's an issue, but on a carbureted engine I really wouldn't be concerned at all. It's just a good negotiating point really. They're very easy to change, you can do them in about an hour, and they're no more than about £65–70 for a new aftermarket carburetor, which always solves the problem virtually. The only time you want to be worried is if it displays any of the symptoms that I mentioned earlier. So once you've gone through now, so we've covered the suspension, we've covered the engine, we've covered the drivetrain, and the brakes, etc. So the last thing you really want to be checking is how it drives. So you want to go through all the gears, high, low range, reverse and park. These selectors are notorious for getting a bit out of adjustment, if you like. But one tip is, a lot of the owners I've bought these things off don't realise, they say, oh yeah, when on the advert, they're impossible to get into gear, I don't know what's going on with it. So if we turn this one on now, obviously it's neutral, but it will not go back. But a lot of people don't realise, they keep forcing them, but there's a safety switch cut off on the, or safety cut off on this rear handbrake. So if I hold that in now, it slots, I don't know if I can get the camera on, but it slots right into gear. But they can go out of adjustment, so just make sure it goes in smoothly. If your idle's a bit of wax, if your idle's high, when you try and put it in gear it will grind. That's perfectly normal. I wouldn't be concerned about it unless you think he's been doing it a long time. So just stick it in gear and make sure it drives okay. So we'll start this one up now. Again, it might be a bit of a pig because of the crappy carburetor parts I've got on it, but yeah, it's going to be a bit of a pain. I'll see if I can get it started. If not, we'll carry on elsewhere. Okay, so as you start it up, hopefully it'll last long enough to do this little clip. So what you want to do,